Hello, class. I would like to spend a few minutes talking to you about Augustine. In this video, I just want to say a little bit about his life so that you have an understanding a little bit of the confessions that you're going to be reading from him. But also in the next video, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the philosophy that he believed in and some of the very big themes that you might find in the confessions. We're not reading the whole book, so you might not get quite all the themes that I mentioned in these two videos. First thing you need to know is that Augustine cannot be underestimated for his importance for the Christian faith. Augustine was an extremely brilliant person. He was like a prodigy child. He was a brilliant writer. He was trained in rhetoric and in speaking and in pagan culture, which was like secular culture, but it wasn't secular the way we are today. It was a culture that believed in many different gods and many different rituals to appease those gods. And so Augustine was a great rhetorician. He spoke, like he was a speech writer basically, and a lecturer and a teacher. So absolutely brilliant person who left a humongous mark not only on Western Christianity, but a lot of Western thought as well. And he's best known in Christianity, I'll give it away right now, for his understanding of original sin. Okay, so this is the Augustine we're talking about, the guy who thought that sin and sinfulness is transmitted down through the human race through sexual intercourse, that you are born in sin, you're made from the sinful union of your parents. And so there's this sort of real grip on what human sexuality is when it comes to goodness or when it comes to shame or evilness that comes down through Augustine. I will say more about that later. Let's bracket that off. But if you're wondering who we're talking about, it's this guy. Augustine was a great bishop and a great writer. He was born in 354. That's the middle of the 4th century. And he died in 430, which is the middle of the 5th century. And during those decades, during his lifetime, Rome was losing lots and lots and lots of power. So Rome used to be a very powerful empire. It was under siege most of his life from barbarians, from the Goths, from the Germanic tribes, from other Greek warriors. And so Rome was both spreading into Europe at this time, but also really on its way down. So Augustine writes in a very chaotic time, politically and culturally and philosophically. He's born in 354 into just a sort of middle-class, modest family in North Africa, in Thagast, which is today in modern Algeria. And what we know about Algeria today is it continues to be and is also a fairly chaotic, not well-run country. Has a lot of desert in it. Yeah, you can look up Algeria today, but Augustine was born in Algeria, so he's an Algerian person, which makes him a non-European person. His parents were basically farmers. His dad was a pagan, so his dad was not a Christian. His dad converted on his deathbed. When his dad died, he became a Christian. The dad became a Christian right before he died. And his mother, though, was a very devout Christian. And you need to think about Augustine with his mother. His mother is the very, very famous Monica. Those of you raised in the Catholic Church might have heard about Saint Monica. She is Augustine's completely overbearing mother, who literally controls his life even into his mid-30s, right? Very devout woman who prays for him, cries over him, is devastated by all the kinds of sins he has. And so Augustine and Monica kind of go together here in this whole theology and in this story. Augustine was a very vivacious and physical loving person. So he loved sexuality, he loved having sex, he loved exploits, he loved drinking, he loved eating. He was very alive. He had friends, and he was very alive. And all of these kinds of ways of enjoying desire were seen as sinful to Augustine's mother, but it was also seen as uncontrolled passions by many leading philosophers of the day. So Augustine lived in an ancient culture where the leading thinkers believed that the human being was not to give in to the desires for food, the desires for sex, the desires for sleep and drink and warmth and good clothing and all these kind of material, rich, quote unquote, riches that Augustine loved were not necessarily valued by either the Christians or leading pagan philosophers of his day. And he lived in a time where Neoplatonic philosophy reigned. And I'll talk about Neoplatonism in my own lecture. But it's important for you to understand this sort of ancient way of thinking about the universe because it has deeply affected the way we think theologically about God. Anyway, so Augustine struggles his whole life with his love for life and the desires that he has. As a young man, he actually falls in love with a very poor woman who he lives with and is his concubine, basically. He never marries her, lives with her. They have a child, a son that Augustine loves, and he loves his girlfriend very, very, very much. By the time he gets into his late 20s, I want to say, his mother saw or convinced him that the only way he would have any kind of career in his culture was if he married a woman who was his status. And so Monica worked very hard to find Augustine a proper wife. And she insisted that he let his concubine and his girlfriend, that he let his girlfriend and his lover, that he dismiss her and never see her again and break up with her and not have her in his life anymore. So his girlfriend and their son left Augustine when he was in his mid-20s, and his mother insisted that he find a wife of good means. And Augustine really struggled with this too, because he really loved his girlfriend and had to struggle with the fact that she was maybe only fulfilling his physical desires and not necessarily his intellectual desires. So Augustine lives in a really interesting culture where men of a certain stature had to follow very specific kinds of rules to have a certain kind of social status in their world. Augustine falls into a cult called Manichaeism. He was very influenced by a thinker named Mani, M-A-N-I, who was a very, very strict leader. Manichaeans basically believed that everything in the material world was evil, was bad, and was trying to imprison our souls. This is very Neoplatonic, right? They also believed that God was not powerful, but that God was all good. So this is super interesting, very ancient question about the goodness and the justice of God that I introduce to you now because it's extremely old, and someone like Augustine is struggling with that just as much as we are today. So today you're going to find Christians and Jews who will say, we believe that God is all-knowing, but not all-powerful, or not all-knowing. God is all-loving, omnibenevolent, all-loving, but not all-powerful, omnipotent. Because if God was omnipotent, omnipotent, if God was omnipotent, all-powerful, then there would be no evil in the world. And if God is all-powerful and lets evil exist, then God must not be good. And that was Mani's position, that if God was truly all-powerful, God would not accept the evil in the world. And if God accepts the evil in the world, it means God must have created the evil. And so Augustine falls in with this crowd of Manichaeans who really saw the world as being in a cosmic battle between good and evil. And this is where we can go on to a whole detour about Star Wars and the theology of Star Wars, and how there's this sense that the human has this intuition to believe that something is either all good or either all evil. And Mani was in that position, and he really saw the Old Testament God as engaging in evil, immoral acts, and therefore we should not actually have the Old Testament. So Augustine is in with this crowd who wants to get rid of the Old Testament, who sees cosmic life in terms of good and evil, and who also sees all matter and material things and desires as bad, as working to imprison our souls that are trying to get set free. So this is in his younger days. Augustine converts to Christianity in his early 30s when he is in Milan, which is a very important chapter for him in his life. His mother is over the moon and beyond and beside herself that her son finally converts to Christianity and gets baptized. But what Augustine carries with him into Christianity is a lot of these Neoplatonic ideas about a hierarchy of beings, about angels being the most spiritual things, while those of us who are in physical bodies being maybe tainted with evil, right? Being tainted with sin. And so he carries also a lot of these Manichaean ideas into Christianity on some level as well. Again, this suspicion around the beauty and goodness of sexual desire, right? Augustine finally affirms affirms that material things are good, and he really leaves the Mani cult because he wants to affirm the goodness of creation. And he supposedly never really intended to make original sin based on sexuality, that his thoughts have been reduced to that. What Augustine really was working against as a Christian and also in his pagan days was the notion that our desires could overtake our rational judgment. That when we follow all of our desires, we don't use rational judgment. We don't think about the consequences. And so you'll see when he's talking about himself as an infant, he's talking about how he was aware of consequences. And his talking about himself as an infant is going to strike a lot of you as almost abusive, distasteful, because of the way he describes himself as an infant giving into his own desires. But I think what Augustine leaves us is this notion that out of his own life is a journey that is seeking the goodness and the beauty of God. And unfortunately, or for better or worse, Augustine does that maybe at the expense of human flesh, of our bodies, of human desire, of humans' needs for intimacy, right? And especially over against women. Augustine had as much as he loved his mother and as much as he loved his female girlfriend, he had no respect for women's judgment or women's rational capacities. So he even said that if God really wanted to make humanity a real companion in Genesis, God would have made Adam another male companion so that the two of them can be true companions. But as Augustine believes, what God did instead was to make Adam a female companion, really only for the sake, not of physical pleasure and intimacy, but for the sake of perpetuating the human race. And in moments of his life, Augustine didn't even believe that we should perpetuate the human race, because there were apparently in the 5th century enough humans in the world for Augustine, right? So it's very interesting to read him and see the complexity of his thought about God and about the world based on his own life. His is the classic theo-autobiography, where he reflects on his own life and reflects on how his whole life has been a search for and a journey towards God's presence and God's beauty. Okay, I talked too long. I'll stop there. That was just a little bit about Augustine's biography. Some great stuff you can read about him on the web. Some of you have introductions to his life, maybe in the book that you bought in his Confessions. It's worth reading about his life and learning a little bit more about Augustine as you read the Confessions. And I look forward to seeing what you discovered. Thanks for your attention.